South Africa's immigration and border control laws always come under scrutiny at this time of the year. This week, 33 undocumented Zimbabwean nationals were intercepted at the Beitbridge border post. But even more worrying, the Border Management Authority last week rescued 433 Zimbabwean children under the age of 8 in what Home Affairs Minister Dr. Aaron Motsoaledi suspects was linked to human trafficking. For more on this discussion, we're now joined by Advocate Simba Chitando, the lawyer for Zimbabwe Exemption Permit Holders Association. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. We're speaking child trafficking, which has now become a very alarming issue, and knowing that there are children now being trafficked from Zimbabwe into South Africa is quite worrying. Do we know why there's now suddenly a spike in this between these countries?
I think I do. I have to say from the outset, I disagree with the characterization by the Minister of Home Affairs. What we have seen, and I've been involved in matters regarding alleged human trafficking or child trafficking from Zimbabwe into South Africa. What we've seen is a clampdown on their version of Zimbabwean parents bringing their children into the country. The requirements have changed, almost, I would say, arbitrarily. And many parents, Zimbabwean parents, do not know that without the documentation that the Department of Home Affairs is expecting, they will be committing what the Department of Home Affairs calls child trafficking.
Okay.
And so what we are actually seeing is a more benign situation, in my view, of parents who do not have the affidavits and the other documentation that Home Affairs is asking for. And for that reason, the department says this is child trafficking, when in fact they're just children on the way to see their families.
So are you saying that over 400 children would be traveling all at once to be meeting up with their families that are based in South Africa from Zimbabwe?
Well, I think the reports were that they weren't all coming all at once. And the reports were also that the Border Management Authority, which is a new institution that the government has implemented, they were conducting a crackdown of laws and regulations and requirements that previously didn't exist. So they were implementing laws for the first time in a crackdown and managed to get the global amount of 400 and so number of children. So I think the way in which it has been characterized is not actually the events on the ground.
And why do you think the department and the minister would characterize it in that way, knowing that there's a shift in how now the laws are being placed, and if it's been a norm in how parents have sent their children to South Africa, why would they conclude that it would be human trafficking?
Well, it's because that is the requirements that they've put in. They're saying that if you do not have these documents, which is an affidavit, many of the Zimbabwean parents don't even know what an affidavit is. And they don't have, unabridged birth certificates, etc. Then they automatically say that's human trafficking. Why is it happening now? Well, I think we are seeing a political climate, where immigration is an issue, and the Department of Home Affairs is trying its best, not just with this Border Management Authority and clamp down on the trafficking laws, which they're using to target the parents who they say are in the country illegally. That's what we have been seeing even before now, and it is also, I think in your intro, linked to the time of season. It is happening now because we are in the festive season, and many of these parents want to be with their children during that time. So I think it's a combination of all of those factors. Home Affairs trying to clamp down on trafficking, the Border Management Authority, which is a new organization, trying to show that it knows what it's doing and it is effective, and parents wanting their kids to come in, not knowing the new requirements, not knowing that there's a new organization called Border Management Authority pushing laws that they've never encountered before.
There's clearly challenges in enforcing these laws? How differently would you advise these laws be enforced so that we are on the same page?
That's a very good question. I think what needs to happen is that there should be dialogue between the Zimbabwean government and the South African government, where the South African government says to the Zimbabwean government, this is what we are going to be doing. We're going to be clamping down on these, parents who do not meet the criteria. South Africa is a sovereign state. It can set its criteria, who comes in and what they need before they come in. So there needs to be communication on both sides of the border. We have seen this past few days where Botswana and Zimbabwe have relaxed the requirements and South Africa is increasing the requirements. Well, that is South Africa's prerogative. South Africa is going into an election in 2024, and I feel that immigration is one of the major issues in that election. And that said, I believe the government should still, make an effort for purely humanitarian reasons. It's not good to see these reports of children being put in this situation. I think a few years ago I was involved in a case like that where children as young as 2 years old were held by the Department of Home Affairs for more than 6 months in detention because their parents did not have the requirements. No one wants to see children be affected by these political issues, and I think there should be more dialogue, and obviously also to communicate with Zimbabweans themselves, to say that now this is the new law, you must have these documents. I was warmed to hear that some of the bus companies and the malaichas, the people who transport people between the two countries, are no longer going to be taking children if they don't have the requirements. So there's some positive news in that regard.
You would also appreciate, though, that countries all over the world are trying to clamp down on human trafficking. And we are seeing a spike in a lot of children being moved between countries. A week ago we saw 17 children, about 14 children being moved on a bus by a couple to Cape Town, and these children were most likely going to be trafficked. Do you not believe that in increasing some of these laws, like you said, in the way that the South African government is doing, is for the protection of these children?
I think it serves two purposes. I'm not the only one who believes that it serves two purposes. There definitely is an element of, the best way to get rid of undocumented foreign nationals, adult foreign nationals in South Africa, is to strictly implement the trafficking laws, because then you could get them out that way. That there is an element of that. But I do agree with you that human trafficking all over the world is an issue. And South Africa is not the only country that has an obligation, a right, and obviously an obligation to clamp down on the criminals who are trafficking, children for heinous reasons, and obviously that is something that the government has to do. So my advice to the South African government, as a lawyer and as a politician, I would say adopt a more common sense approach. When you know, and often they do know that, okay, in a case, on a case-by-case basis, there's a situation where the foreign national doesn't, this is the mother, she's with her 5-year-old, that is a family. Don't implement the traffic laws because she doesn't understand what an affidavit is. She doesn't understand what an unabridged birth certificate is. Don't implement it in that situation. There's common sense on the ground. In a situation where it's quite obvious that you have a child in the hands of what looks like a stranger, then definitely implement the trafficking laws. So, common sense approach. That's what I advise.
So in your two-pronged approach, which you mentioned earlier on, in saying that the government could possibly be implementing this to get rid of illegal foreigners in South Africa and be using the children not having coming into the country as a way to keep them out. What's your specific take on that?
Well, it has happened before. I was involved, I mentioned it a couple of times in this interview. I was involved in a case, I think, pre-COVID, and they had children, Zimbabwean children, who were traveling with their parents. And the parents didn't have the documentation, and they called it trafficking. Some of them were as young as 2 years old, 2, 5, 6 years old. And it was very clear, even from I think it was Department of Social Development, that those were their parents. They were speaking to them, and they allowed the visitation. It was clear that those are the parents. But they said, look, if we are going to release them, you must bring your documents. The parents must bring their documents that they're in the country legally. And they couldn't do that. In the end, they all had to leave. So that was a specific instance when it was used to fish out the parents in the country illegally or without documentation or pending legal documentation and have applied for it.
Right. So you made mention earlier on that there needs to be collaboration between the two governments in educating people. How else would you advise parents currently, before the government intervention, not to find themselves in those situations?
Well, I think what has happened is it has shocked the public on both sides of the border. In fact, probably internationally. It's a large number of children. So I think what I would advise any parent who loves their children would see what has happened and thought, I do not want that to happen to my children. We do not want it to happen again. And the bus companies have all noticed what has happened. They do not want to be put in that situation where they have to do a U-turn and be implicated in human trafficking. No one wants that for their business. So I think the lesson has been learned. And I think also for the South African government, I'm sure it was very horrible for the Border Management Authority to be involved in, detaining and returning 400 screaming children, frightened, terrified kids. Must have been a horrible experience for them too. I don't think anyone enjoys what has happened. This is a humanitarian problem, yeah, I think we've all learned our lesson, and hopefully it won't happen again.
Most certainly. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and for your inputs. That is Advocate Simba Chitando, the lawyer for the Zimbabwe Exemption Permit Holders Association, speaking to us there about the alleged child trafficking from the Department of Home Affairs, with Zimbabwean children coming to visit their families in South Africa.